COVID-19 kept us apart. This year, we're finally together again.
President Biden delivering a historic State of the Union address tonight. Let's take a live look in Washington, D.C., where that address just wrapped up moments ago. President Biden turning his attention to Russia and Ukraine right away. Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Fox 40 News. I'm Nikki Lorenzo. President Biden saying the U.S. and our allies stand behind Ukraine. So he praised the bravery of the people of Ukraine during this difficult time and condemned Vladimir Putin's actions.
When the history of this era is written, Putin's war in Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger.
Joining us now to talk about the president's address, we have our political experts joining us once again. On the Republican side, Tim Rosales. On the Democratic side, Ed Emerson. Guys, thanks so much for being with us this evening. We have about 10 minutes, so I don't want to waste much time here. Ed, we'll start with you since you're the Democrat at the virtual table. You're the lucky one. President's speech, your reaction, go.
I give him an A-. I thought it was a good speech. I thought he started well. I thought that he was consistent throughout. I thought it was obvious, a no-brainer to start with the situation, the war in Ukraine, and unbridled aggression by a totalitarian regime. I thought I thought perhaps he might talk or announce something about student debt. Student loan debt, which I was really is a big issue for me and for my family. I thought he did a good job transitioning. He got good bipartisan support. He has been consistent, if nothing else, on the fund the police. I thought that was a very important moment in the speech. The battle against COVID. Although he didn't declare a clear victory because we're not there yet. But we have administered 550 million vaccines to Americans across the country. Something like 70% of people have been vaccinated. So he was able to highlight that. Just fascinating, just little things for me. Joe Manchin sitting with the Republicans, I thought was a fascinating little piece of theater there. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was only shown once this year as opposed to 12 times last year. I thought the president set a great tone. I thought he had, I was mentioning this to Tim earlier, big finish. He was excited. He was animated. He was showing the energy, I think, that it takes to handle a crisis. We are in a crisis, no question about it. He addressed inflation. He addressed gas prices. He did not announce a whole slew of new initiatives, which the State of the Union has sort of become over the years. And I think he's going to be happy with it. I think Democrats are going to be happy with it overall. And I look forward to the next 10 days are going to be crucial in terms of the future of Ukraine. And I think this president has put together an alliance of our friends, 40 countries, 39 countries, I think, in NATO and the EU. I think it was a good speech.
All right, Tim, I want to get you to weigh in, too. Now, your thoughts on the president's first State of the Union.
Well, I think, it's California, so I'll give him an E for effort, right? Because that's what California schools do now. Nobody's giving A's, B's, C's, D's anymore. I'll give him an E for effort. I think that what the president did, he certainly came out, I think, rightly so, and strengthened his resolve against and the resolve of the United States against Russia. That is a good way to start any speech, getting that out there because all Americans, I think, right now are out there in their support for Ukraine, and nothing rallies a country like opposition to Russia or the old Soviet Union. So that was good. I think that the rest of the speech, he touched on a number of things. My take on the president, so far his administration has been very defensive and reactive. I think I don't know that he was able to overcome that in this speech, and still at the end and going into these midterms, there are several issues that he's going to have to deal with, his administration is going to have to deal with, if he is going to try to save control of Congress in the hands of Nancy Pelosi. I disagree with Ed where I don't really think he touched on inflation. He talked about it. He talked about gas prices. He talked about some of those things. But there was nothing in the speech that, from an economic perspective, is going to do anything to correct the inflation that we're seeing here, the highest in 40 years. And so what's going to happen is they'll force, the Fed, which they're probably going to do anyway, to increase, interest rates even more than they have in order to correct this out of control inflation. But there really is no corrective action that we're seeing on the side of the president, the executive, or the legislative, because I think, as the Iowa governor talked about, that there's been this unleashing of spending, and there is nothing to rein in that spending. When you have that spending that increases, and you have prices increasing at a higher rate than wages, and you can't do that by just an artificial hike in inflation. You really have to do that across the board, and I don't think that is something that is any actions here that the president talked about in his speech is really going to do much to curb that inflation. And so you're going to have those interest rates, try to wrangle that in, but really until Congress and the president does that, it's not going to help. And I think that's going to be really an Achilles heel long term going into November for Democratic candidates, unless they can do something substantive in terms of inflation.
I want to share a bit of a tweet that David Axelrod, if you recognize that name, he was the chief strategist during the campaign for President Obama, also a top advisor. And he reacted this way on Twitter. He said, "Hard to avoid making a State of the Union speech sound like a laundry list. The tide did not turn tonight." So, Ed, and I'll ask both of you this. We have about 2 minutes left. Ed, I'll start with you. You get 30 seconds. I mean, does the State of the Union address really, we're in a midterm election year. We tick through some of the issues that we're facing right now, get Ukraine out of it, just coming out of COVID, inflation, higher prices. I mean, does this change voters' minds?
I don't think so. I really don't. I think you have the opportunity to energize the base. I think that's going to be key for the midterm elections in the fall, is getting people excited about an agenda. And I think he needs to get out there. I mean, usually what you do after the State of the Union is you go out and you sell your program. I think with the current crisis in the Ukraine, he's not going to have the opportunity to do that. I think he could have hit some of the other points much stronger. I wish he'd have made a better case of why the American people should invest and be engaged in the conflict in the Ukraine. But I usually hit the road. I mean, you come right out of the State of the Union and you're on the road in swing states and swing districts around the country. I think Democrats still have a case to make. And I think they're in a tough spot in terms of the
all right, we got 45 seconds. Hate to cut you off, Ed, but I want Tim to be able to weigh. What do Republicans need to do following this speech?
Well, I think they need to do what Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds talked about, and I think keep repeating those messages, talking about the economy, talking about inflation, talking about high gas prices. I think talking about energy independence, which the president hasn't done, and I think this Ukraine crisis has only heightened that conversation, and also. I think talking about public safety in a more defined way, as well as homelessness, which is not just a California problem. But all
right, we're getting the rap music. Tim, Ed, we got to go. We'll have more on a special news at 9. We'll see you then.
I salute you both.
Take care.